This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everyone. Let me just give you a little bit of background then on what we're doing here, which those who've actually taken the course so far will already know. But since we're recording this series of lectures and we're going to make them available via our website, maybe I could just explain the basic setup. This is the second half of a quantitative analysis training course for the humanities. It's an HRC-funded doctoral training program. But this second half consists of public lectures. The program really began in consultation between SAS and UCL and King's College, and specifically between myself and Professor David Davray at UCL and Professor Paul Redmond at King's College. And we had the idea of putting on this sort of course to give a basic sort of intellectual toolbox, really, to humanities researchers. Quantitative methods have transformed many elements of the humanities, but we felt that there still weren't enough people, coming through the universities with the necessary skills to apply those methods, or indeed to really benefit them in terms of consumers of research. And many people who go on to do humanities degrees will have dropped maths at probably the earliest possible stage, as certainly I did. And so one of the challenges I suppose we faced was to make a course like this appealing. And so the way that we devised it was that the first half really would be a series of seminar taught sessions, and we were very pleased to be able to use the services of Doug Brown from King's College, who devised a lot of the sessions himself and taught them. The idea was that in the second half we would have a series of what we called masterclass lectures by academics and practitioners who actually apply these techniques in their ordinary work. And we had a kind of a wish list of people, which we thought was very ambitious. But to our delight, almost everyone we asked agreed. And so I think we've got a fantastic series this term, beginning with Julian Hoppit, who I'll introduce in a minute, but including people from the Royal Statistical Society, from YouGov, from Mori, from the BBC, and from, indeed, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of London himself later on, who we're very pleased to have. So we've been delighted by the response to this. But it's a great pleasure to be able to initiate the series with a lecture by Professor Julian Hoppit from UCL's History Department. Julian has been based at UCL since 1987, and he is now the Astor Professor of British History. He's researched and published very extensively on the period roughly between the 1660s and 1800, looking at the interface between political and economic history. He convenes the IHR seminar, the Economic and Social History of the Premodern World, and he's a fellow of the British Academy. His talk today is entitled An Historian's Encounter with Counting. So, Julian, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The reason why we've all accepted it is because there's a really nice tea beforehand. So that was great. I ought to explain to the camera that the reason why I've been looking up at the ceiling so far is because it's such an interesting ceiling. I've never been in this room before. So as Philip says, what I've been asked to do is to provide you with an introduction to how I've pursued history in a quantitative way through my research, which stretches back now to the late 1970s. You can do the maths to work out how many years that was or is. I'm not going to focus at all upon statistical techniques. As you'll discover quickly enough, I don't use statistical techniques. What I'm interested in trying to tell you something about is what I would call my quantitative imagination or sensibility, why numbers matter to me in my research, both in terms of undertaking that research and presenting my findings. So I'm not going to give you some exercises in statistical history. How I'll proceed is overwhelmingly, of course, concentrate upon my main research projects and give you some flavour of them, focusing upon one in particular, but with attention to some others. My doctoral project, then the bigger project, then some spin-offs from the bigger project. The bigger project still isn't finished. And then I'll make some concluding remarks. But I'll start by saying a little bit about who I am and why historians might want to count at all. I am a historian of Britain, and I'm very keen to emphasise of Britain, not of England. I think that matters a lot. That means, in a sense, I am a comparative historian because I'm interested in differences between England and Scotland and Wales, though one can do much more with the Anglo-Scottish comparison than comparisons with Wales. My period, roughly speaking, runs from 1660, which is the restoration of the monarchy after the Republican experiment, down to 1800, just before union of Britain and Ireland. That's the period that I cover, which means that the sorts of background events, or not just so background events, that crop up in my work are the Restoration, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 9, when William III invaded, the Dutch William invaded, the American independence in 1776, unions with Scotland and Ireland in 1707 and 1801. My focus, those are high political events I've by and large referred to there. My focus, though, as Philip said, is on the intersection between politics and the economy. I certainly started out in life as an economic historian, but I've gradually become a historian of political economy, defined very broadly. So what I'm interested most about nowadays are institutions, especially, in fact, parliaments, and the ideas and interests which influenced how Parliament worked in its attempt to exercise authority over economic life. So that's my broad background. I think it's very important that you know what I've called my disposition is, my predilections, my assumptions. You could come up with a variety of other words to describe them, in fact. A key point, an absolutely central point in my whole approach to history is to get away from, is to question an account of British history which is essentially celebratory. The period that I'm interested in saw Britain begin to emerge as the first industrial nation. The Industrial Revolution is one of the great changes in human history, and it so happens that it began to manifest itself in Britain first. It's very easy to move on from that to thinking to basically a story of British exceptionalism, and there's some merit in that. But almost my whole starting point is to say, let's forget about that. I'm not interested in why Britain became the first industrial nation, but what the implications and processes were of it becoming the first industrial nation. That's to say, I challenge the Whig interpretation of history, or I consciously set myself up as a non-Whig historian. That's absolutely central to what I do. That means that I am very unhappy with teleology of tracing back from a final event, the causes of that alone into the past, the isolation of those causes. That's a form of selectivity which I'm unhappy with. I'm also unhappy, it follows, with hindsight. Hindsight is a great blessing to historians. We couldn't do it without it. But quite often it's a good trick to try and do away with it. So that's one point about my disposition. The second point is that I believe strongly in the utility of concepts and categories. Now that's very important as well, because some historians emphasise the contingency of everything. That's to say, it's all a great mess back there, and there are no particular patterns which can be discerned. What you've got to do is explore how particular actors operated in the particular circumstances they were confronted with. I'm interested in finding patterns in the past. I'm perfectly prepared to admit that in a sense they're fictitious patterns, but I think they're meaningful patterns. At least I hope they're meaningful patterns. And to do that, I have to employ concepts and categories. And I'll say more about that in my examples. The third point about my disposition, which is why I've been asked along, I guess, is because I like to count things. And I want to emphasise, I do a bit more than counting, but I employ simple numbers. My quantification is basic. I increasingly do nothing much more than add, subtract and divide. Seriously, I'm not joking. Once upon a time I used to run correlation coefficients, and I have tried my hand at regression analysis, but it's not for me. I like just those three simple forms of dealing with numbers, now that's rather important, in fact, because it means that I tend to use numbers, generally speaking, in a descriptive way. And we ought to put descriptive here in inverted commas, but it's about identifying things which happened in the past, which then need explaining. So I don't, generally speaking, use numbers to explain things, though they can be a great help to that. Finding coincidences is helpful, but the numbers particularly helped for me to identify just what it is that's at issue, which then needs further research to try to explain. So that's my disposition. My training for all of this is that I have, as Philip had, a very limited training in statistics and economics. I dropped mathematics at what was then O-level. I was trying to remember what it was called in my day. I think it might have been called additional level O-level or something like that. I did do 2 O-levels in maths, but then I stopped. I didn't do any more. I did no economics at school. And the degree that I took at university was a history degree, but I did take a course long since abolished called Economics and Quantitative Methods for Historians. Economics and Quantitative Methods for Historians, set up in fact by Roderick Flood, late of this parish. But I concentrated on the economics. I took none of my classes, seminars, were in the quantitative side. But that's the only sort of what I would consider rigorous training I had. I did no MA. In those days one didn't really need to. I went straight from doing a BA to doing a PhD, which I began in 1979, and the date's meaningful for this talk because it means it's pre-desktop computers. It's not pre-computers, but it's pre-desktop computers. It's pre-Excel, no Excel, there's obviously no World Wide Web. What I did do, my funding body, the predecessor of the SRC, required, what I did do is take a one-term Open University course in quantitative methods. They That was a condition of me doing it, so I had to turn on the radio at 6 o'clock on Sunday morning and listen to people like Peter Laslett going on. But I never had to, I didn't need to submit formal assessment for it, and so on. So, that's my background. Why do historians quantify? Well, for a number of very obvious reasons, most obviously for reasons of precision. Why say someone is very tall when in fact you can specify it in terms of centimetres or feet and inches? Yeah? Why not be precise? It seems obvious that it's better to do it in quite a few circumstances. A second reason, I don't think that's a very powerful reason, or at least it's a powerful reason, but it's an uninteresting reason. A second point, though, about quantification is, and I'll be making quite a bit of play about this, is the ability to look at something within certain limits in a comprehensive way, that you can look at the whole of the field of evidence, which is especially useful where the evidence is voluminous. Now, the evidence needs to take certain forms to be amenable to quantification, but that ability to look at a large body of data in a systematic and precise way is, I think, extraordinarily powerful. Powerful particularly, of course, therefore, fourthly, because one can discern patterns in voluminous evidence, patterns which might be fairly obvious, but actually are quite often not so obvious, and which can therefore throw up surprising and interesting results. And I hope I can give you one or two examples of where that's the case. So it's absolutely crucial to how I do things, as I've already said, is I like to try to establish some patterns in the past. I'm interested in the similarities of events in human actions. I'm almost by definition less interested, not uninterested, but less interested in individuality. Yeah? So nuance is not a word which interests me, though there are plenty of historians who do obsess by it. Fifthly, historians quantify because some historians quantify because it helps them to establish causation, or at least they think it helps them to establish causation, which is a slightly different thing. That's why they run regression analyses. But to do so, they generally speaking have to simplify the variables at issue. And this is why you get divisions opening up between certain branches of history, most notably between economic historians who I would call hardcore quantifiers, cliometricians, and people like me, who would not be considered by those people as an economic historian at all. Finally, one quantifies because it allows one a different form of representation. And I think that's important, that you can present quantitative material in graphs and tables, most obviously, maps as well, in fact, which prose can't get at, or can get at only in an incredibly long-winded way. This goes back to my point about concision. So that's all preparatory, really, and so what I want to do now is move on to my examples, and as I said, I'll start by talking about my doctoral research, which I began in 1979 in this pre-desktop computer, pre-digital camera age. I don't think it was a better age. It was better only insofar as my records were at Chancery Lane in the old PRO and not at Kew. Kew is a great place, it's just a pain to get to. My doctoral research was about businesses which went bankrupt in the 18th century in England. I said earlier that I was a historian of Britain. I focused upon England because the law of bankruptcy differs as between England and Scotland, and one needed to limit one's topic to do a doctoral research, and that seemed a sensible thing to do, given that I was doing my doctoral research in England, Cambridge, in fact. You can see from what I said already about Whig history that the choice of the topic of bankruptcy, the study of failure, relates very much to that. I was interested in exploring why businesses failed in a period when Britain's economy, England's economy, generally speaking, was incredibly successful. I thought failure might tell us something about success from an unusual perspective. My period was pretty specifically 1700 to 1800, and I chose that because it has lots of noughts at the end of those dates. There's a certain arbitrariness there, so I wasn't trying to impose some chronological framework upon it. I alighted on the topic because I'd done an undergraduate dissertation about a very boring aspect of 18th century economic history, but I'd read various correspondence. I'd come at the topic through qualitative sources. I'd read various business correspondence in which problems of indebtedness and bankruptcy seemed to me to crop up more frequently than I'd anticipated, or not that I'd gone in with any anticipation particularly. So I thought this was a potentially neat topic. As I told you, I did a course in economic and quantitative methods, and I had some idea of economic theories of business enterprise as well. There's quite a rich literature going back especially to the 1920s, concerned with something called the theory of the firm, but also through the works of Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter was a very important Austrian economist, ended up at Harvard, who developed very telling ideas about entrepreneurship and innovation. So that provided me with a conceptual framework as well. As I said, bankruptcy is a legal process, and therefore I thought it very likely that there would be good records for me to study. Historians are obviously prisoners of their sources. We can't do anything without them, we can't invent them. So I thought that the legal process would likely have thrown up something. And I knew as a minimum, in fact, that there were some printed sources. Advertisements of bankrupts in the London Gazette. The London Gazette is the official government newspaper, might not be quite the right word, but let's call it that. It still exists, it still publishes. The complete series, this will show you how times have changed, the complete series is now online. So, in fact, the downloaded version came out a bit rubbish, so I went to the library and photographed one for you here from 1755. And I don't know how well you can see that, probably just about all right. So that's an advertisement for one bankrupt. Joseph Jacks, interesting name, possibly of Huguenot heritage, of Chippenham in Wiltshire, grocer, dealer and chapman. He's declared a bankrupt, and he's got to surrender himself at various stated dates there at Guildhall in London. So we know he's been declared a bankrupt, we know who he was, where he was from, what he did. Yeah, so that's a clear printed source. It very quickly became apparent, though, that there's a slightly different manuscript source, and indeed that the London Gazette advertisements are inconsistent. It very quickly became a nightmare to disentangle the London Gazette advertisements, because there are multiple advertisements concerning each bankrupt, and distinguishing which was the first from the others became very hard work, and I started to keep card indexes with names. And it became very, very difficult. So I decided to explore the manuscript sources on which this must have been based. And this is a telling lesson for us all. I discovered that even the manuscript summary contains more information than is contained here. Particularly, the manuscript source tells us who the petitioning creditors were. Yeah, who were the creditors initiating this bankruptcy process? And you can see straight away that opens up another dimension of research. You can study the creditors, who they were, as well as the bankrupts. So it opens up something quite different. What I was very intent on doing was studying all bankrupts. This point about comprehensiveness. So I began accumulating the material, plus the material about the petitioning creditors. This meant going off to the PRO, as it then was called, in Chancery Lane, with paper and pencil and writing it all down, day after day. Nowadays, you would go along there with your digital camera. You would photograph the whole series. I was trying to work out how long it would take. I don't think it would take more than 3 days to photograph the whole series. You go back to your study and you type it all in. I had to transcribe it all by pencil, then go back. No desktop computers, remember, so I had to use a mainframe computer, the time for which was rationed, and the best time I could get most use by typing in the middle of the night. Yeah. So I used to get back from the PRO, go straight to bed, set my alarm for 2 o'clock, cycle down to the computer laboratory, as it was called, type in, get on the train, go to London, and accumulate the material. That's why today is better. Okay, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. It's quite important, this. There's quite a lot of effort involved in being comprehensive in this way, even for a source which is actually quite basic. There are not very many fields in each record. So this is a record, one person. There are various fields. I'm not interested in name analysis, but you could make that. Gender, you could obviously do. Place, occupation, and obviously date. But it's not very many variables there. But over the 18th century, there were 33,000 bankrupts. And some of those were partnerships, so you'd have 2 names. And we have details for 22,000 petitioning creditors. Again, some of those will be partnerships. So I collected data on, I counted them again today for you, 61,130 records. Okay. So that's quite a lot of sitting in the computer laboratory in the middle of the night, typing in. I don't know how long it took to do. Anyhow. But the data needs coding. Some of the data needs coding, obviously, and occupation in particular needs coding. It needs coding because otherwise you simply have so many different occupational designations that you can't make sense of it. Okay, I can't remember how many different occupational designations there were, but I imagine it ran to about 1,000 or something like that. There's no point counting with so many designations. You've got to put them within some free framework, some categorization. So I had to develop, to do that, I had to develop an occupational categorization, and this is the one that I did. And you can see those are the 13 main headings, and how many, and then there was another layer beneath that of sub-headings, and I've given the number in each case. If I was to do it all again, I'd do things slightly differently. 10 is a good maximum number of categories, in fact. 13 is a bit too many, and I would have regularised things a bit. But I'll come on to what I think I consider one of my later, better schemes of categorisation. So I typed all of this data in to the computer with some coding, some assigning of categorisation. I also, in fact, although I never used the data, put in a grid reference for each place, so that one could have mapped all of this stuff and done some calculations, in fact, of the distance between creditors and bankrupts. I never did that, but I put in that data. But in the end, I got sick of my project. There's only so much I was prepared to do. But what it meant was I got this data set of all of these bankrupts, lots of creditors. They then needed to be analysed, and you can process it in various obvious ways. Accumulations over time, geographically, occupationally, and then, of course, variables, cross-tabulations of that as well, in fact. And that's fine, of course. One can describe absolute numbers pretty easily. That's not so difficult. I no longer have access to any of this data because it was on the mainframe computer when they did away with that. It's probably on some magnetic tape somewhere deep in the bowels of some Cambridge repository, but I know, so I just had to photograph my book to produce this graph for you. So this is a straightforward way of describing those 33,000 bankrupts to you. And you can obviously describe it in a different way by looking at quarterly fluctuations. I'll come back to this. Yeah, so it's just a different chronological unit of time that I'm employing, which gives, and I've done something else here, which I'll come back to in a bit. But all absolute numbers have limits to their utility. You need to relate them to something. That's what gives them real purchase. Is 5% a little or a lot? Well, in some circumstances, 5% is a lot. George Osborne would be dancing for joy if the British economy was growing at 5% per annum. I would be incredibly depressed if only 5% of my students graduate this year. Yeah. So one's got to know context. You've got to have some yardstick to put such numbers against. And there are some obvious ones that one might do in a case like this. What are the estimates for the rate of growth of the British economy in the period? GNP. The rates of growth after 1750 of bankruptcy are much greater. How does this relate, for example, to population growth, for which we now have good figures, published in 1981 by Wrigley and Schofield? This is much faster. Those are both slightly detached, or overseas trade, for which we've got statistics. I thought it would be interesting to try to relate it to the size of the business community. What's the relevant population that might have gone bankrupt. So I poured through trade directories, published lists of businesses which existed for certain places. London was best, but Manchester, Liverpool and some other places, it was the case as well. And that then can lead on to some major conclusions. And the major conclusion of this piece of research was that there were rising rates of bankruptcy, not just absolute numbers, but rates of bankruptcy in 18th century England, which is apparently counterintuitive given that the economy is booming. Aren't people making lots of profit? Isn't there just money dripping off trees for them to scoop up? Things like that. You still read about this. The assumptions that profit margins in the 18th century, in 18th century Britain, or bits of it, the slave trade is a very good example, or the plantations, slave plantations, you still read works which assume that profit margins were unusually wide. Whereas my findings suggest otherwise, just in the case of the English economy. It doesn't relate to the plantation economies, of course. And that, therefore, so you can see what I've done. All of this great effort has identified a key point that needs explanation, that it's unexpected, it seems paradoxical, and then you get into trying to explain it, which leads to various things. And I don't think part of my purpose here is to give you those explanations, because they don't particularly have a quantitative basis to it. But they're hinted at, in fact, by graphs such as this, which is the erratic nature of the line. That there are clearly moments where numbers in particular surge upwards. And these are crises of one sort. Well, basically they're financial crises. So you can see for 1793 there are 1,276. That's a major financial crisis. We knew it was a major financial crisis before, but the magnitude of it becomes more apparent, and then that starts, of course, suggesting to you various aspects of causation. This is a question to the audience. What's the most famous financial crisis of 18th century Britain? The South Sea Bubble, thank you very much, which is in 1720. No peak. That peak you can see is the late 1720s. So another good thing with quantification can be the helping you to notice things which didn't happen, or didn't happen in the way in which they're portrayed as happening. So I've written an article years later when I was asked to do something at rather short notice called The Myths of the South Sea Bubble, which was simply prompted by that observation that there was no great surge of bankruptcy in 1720, as you would have expected, given the usual narratives of the South Sea Bubble. There's plenty that's right in the usual narratives of the South Sea Bubble, but on this particular point, about the crisis infecting the whole of the economy, I think it's wrong. The final point I want to make about this project to you is, which I hope I've already sort of hinted at, is of course the ability of to present material in a different form from qualitative prose. This graph, and it goes back to my point about concision and precision, this graph does tell you something about all 33,000 bankrupts. Okay? It captures the whole of that experience, only in one respect, I agree. But nonetheless, it seems to me a remarkable... I should have said at the start, this lecture is rather bound to be egotistical, but it compresses to an amazing degree all of this evidence, this pile of evidence that I've gone through, and it helps you visualise history in a different way. So you can do things. So the previous graph gave you a trend, simple annual numbers, but then you can then do some things like what's the variation from the trend, okay? What's the percentage variation from that trend that we just saw? There are various ways of calculating a trend. I quite commonly simply use a moving average because most people can get their heads around what a moving average is. And this is another way of doing it. So again, you can probably hardly see it at all. 1720 is here. This is the South Sea Bubble. Whereas this peak, previously, nobody had any idea that there were major difficulties then. One can obviously also present material in a tabular form. That's obvious, straightforward. So that's what I've done in this example. As you can see, you can play around with the chronologies involved. And you can map. So here I've simply given you a map of the 15 counties in England with the least number of bankrupts, the least number. I did it for the 15 most and the 15 least. I played around in all sorts of ways with the data to try and find interesting patterns. And this grouping in what I will broadly call, slightly inaccurately, East Midlands, is distinctive. And again, you can see that this finding raises questions, and those questions then need answering. Okay, so that's my doctoral project. Perhaps in one respect, those days were better, in there wasn't quite the same pressure to finish that there is today, so I was more languid in my efforts. I finished my thesis in 1984. I was exhausted by it, but I turned it into a book, quite a short book, which goes to the point about concision. And I then started casting about for a separate topic. I was very conscious that my project was a piece of economic history lacking much of a human dimension. I did in fact have some case studies in it. I had a chapter which went into some of these experiences in more detail. I found detailed files, about 152 bankrupts. They were unrepresentative for various ways, but I went into them in a certain amount of detail. I thought quite an interesting follow-up might be, you might say that this shows that I have a slightly warped mind, would be to study suicide. because, of course, it was commonly said that bankrupts were especially liable to commit suicide. Edward Gibbon's, I can't now remember if it was his father or grandfather, committed suicide because of bankruptcy. I think that's right. I hope that's right, but anyhow. So I thought, and again, suicide, you see, would go through coroner's courts in most cases. I thought there'd be records there. This would be interesting, be different. I was all set to go, and I opened Past and Present, and blow me, there was an article about suicide in early modern England. Rather a good article, I was ashamed to find. And so that scuppered that. So it's just an interesting example of, I think I did have a good idea, but somebody else had it first. And they did it, and I just didn't feel like going into the same field. So I thrashed around, frankly, for a time, looking for a second project. What had interested me, I have this slight interest in economic theory. What I was interested in was the role of the law in bankruptcy, and the role of the law, in fact, in relation to indebtedness more generally. So I sort of did a bit of reading about the state and the economy and this sort of thing. And then simply through a process of connection, of personal connection, I was introduced indirectly to someone called Sheila Lambert, now dead, sadly. And Sheila Lambert did a lot of work in the 1960s and 70s on parliamentary records, especially printed parliamentary records, not exclusively so. Probably her biggest publication are a series of over 100 volumes reprinting reports of the House of Commons, which are on the shelves in the IHR. But what Sheila Lambert had done in particular was seek to identify efforts made in Parliament to pass legislation which weren't enacted. It was quite a complicated sentence I just gave you this, but essentially bills, though in fact more broadly than bills which were not enacted. They failed legislation. She produced a hand list of sort, associated in fact with this series of reports, which covered quite a bit of the 18th century for the House of Commons, though not entirely in a systematic way. She realised she was never going to finish this project, so she handed her, an incredible act of generosity, she handed her notes over to me and a colleague called Joanna Innes, and Jo's at Oxford, at Somerville College. And what we decided to do was to polish off this work. Polish off makes it sound like there wasn't very much work to do. I can assure you there was quite a lot of work to do. Sheila had probably done about, I don't know, never really thought about this, half. So Jo and I had to do the other half. Why might this be interesting? Because it goes back to why the study of bankruptcy might be interesting. Parliament is portrayed in many respects as a successful institution after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. In particular, that it's in the hands of landowners who can get it to do what they want. Yeah? And in those circumstances, the starting hypothesis would be that there's a low failure rate, and indeed perhaps even a trivial failure rate, that most efforts at legislation were successful. The overwhelming majority of them were successful. So it seemed to me to be to open up the potential for making some interesting general points about the evolution of Parliament as an institution as it affected the economy. That was always and remains my particular interest. What it was decided was that Jo and I would apply for a grant, or more particularly I would apply for a grant from the Leverhulme Trust to help with this, and we got some funding for it. As it turned out, grossly inadequate funding. That was my miscalculation. How do you go about establishing a definitive list of failed legislation? Well, you go along to the parliamentary archives, don't you? No. Parliament was burned down in 1834, and many of the parliamentary records were destroyed. We depend heavily upon printed sources, especially for the House of Commons. For the period 1660 to 1800, there are 48 volumes of the journals of the House of Commons. 48 of these volumes. They are, as you can see, as you can't see the size of them here, they're very large pages, double column. So there are 48 for the House of Commons for my period, 32 for the House of Lords. There are 63,351 pages in total. That's what you've got to trawl through, identifying mentions of potential legislation which were not enacted. Yeah? So you're looking for something which is not then on the statute book. So you've got to have your eye on the statute book as well. So that's quite hard. The indexes of the House of Commons are not adequate to the task. So here's an example of an attempt to get an act. As you can see, you've got the date. Tells you it's a petition from a particular individual who's lord of the manor of some places in Northampton. He's also the owner of the great tithes there, but it also comes in from the reverend. And what do they want? That there are within, so I'm in the middle of the paragraphs, there are within the said manors and parish several open, common and arable lands and fields, common meadows and common grounds. So this is in fact a petition wanting to enclose the parish, that's to say redistribute ownership of the land. We know that there's lots of enclosure, parliamentary enclosure in 18th century England. This is an attempt to get one such act. I don't know whether this succeeded or not. I didn't bother to, life is too short, I didn't bother to follow it up for this particular instance. They come in different forms though. This is another one which comes in from the Guild of Silk Manufacturers in London, wanting something completely different. But you can see this gives you a sense of the nature of the source that one's handling, in fact. And what we were able to do with this was identify just over 7,000 attempts to get legislation which failed, attempts in Parliament which failed across that period, 1660 to 1800, 7,000. And the data then obviously needs putting in some sort of systematic format. And there are a number of obvious things that I've already shown. We've got the date, we know which house, whether it's the Commons or the Lords that was initiated in, but in particular what one needs to do is to apply a subject scheme to it. And here I think, so my bankruptcy work seemed to me to be an apprentice's work. This seems to me to be better as a subject scheme. So I used a 3-tier system with 10 main subheadings, and I've listed them 0 to 9. If you begin with 0, then you only need 1 digit to represent 10. Okay, so that's important. That's that saves you 1 keystroke. These things matter when you're having to do it thousands of times. 31 subheadings and 168 particular headings. So in those 3 tiers, the utility of this is that you can then, in fact, you're not confined by this scheme, because you can draw out particular headings which are under different headings, and group them together if you want, so that you can make a category of, say, agriculture or the land in some way. There are all sorts of different things. This will give you an example of how, so just to remind you, number 7 there is the economy. This is the detailed breakdown of the economy categorization that I employed there. I didn't just do it by subject matter. I'm not sure what the next slide is. Okay. So we're now. My wife and I bought our first Macintosh computer in 1984. So that's when desktop computers were readily available. Reasonably readily available. You get them a bit earlier than that. Eventually, I just simply translated all of the stuff onto Excel. And Excel is what I use for almost all of my accounting. And this is simply a screenshot of the failed legislation database. And it gives you some sense of how it's done. In fact, some of this data is not input directly. It's a consequence of other codes. But you can see from the S and the G, that's a simple binary, an alternative there. General means applying to the nation as a whole, or one of the constituent parts of the British nation. S means specific. That's important because the contemporary distinction between public and private legislation is not very meaningful. An act to turnpike a road, so a specific bit of road, the road from Billsway to Sandy, would be a public act, even though it's rather clearly of local significance, and what you're doing is instituting a board of trustees, a specific body to administer the road. So we invent specific, and I invented specific and general, and then there's code 1 and code 2. Some things you can't just give one subject code to. You can see in the code 1, what I've done there is use a 3-digit subject code along with, in fact, two letters of the alphabet, which are geographical designations. So simply in one field, I can combine pretty detailed subject code and a geographical code. Excel allows you, using the right and the left function, subsequently to strip out a certain number of characters from the left or from the right, so you can put them into different columns, but you just need to fill in one field. And basically, in the end, you can get your head round all of these, whatever it was, 168 particular headings, and all of the geographical codes. You can just remember it and key it in rather more quickly than you might imagine. This wasn't anything like as bad as doing the bankruptcy stuff. Okay, so you code the data, you input it in here, you then start to process it. I'm not quite sure what the next act is. Yes, next slide. You want, and again, it comes back to what I was saying about bankruptcy. You're not so interested in absolute numbers, but in relative numbers to population, overseas trade, economic growth, those sorts of things. The problem is they're all rather vague. What particularly makes it telling, which I've already implied, is relating these numbers to the numbers of acts. And we know the number, of course, we know the number of acts. The definitive source of them, of course, is still in the House of Lords. It's called the Parliamentary Archives. But you can go there and look at them all if you want. They did survive the fire. But that's very time-consuming, and I'm sure the archivists there would get completely fed up with you if you asked to look at all 14,217 which were passed between 1660 and 1800. There are published lists, more or less contemporaneous published lists. This is one particular volume, which doesn't give you the text of all acts, but it gives you the short title. And actually not so short, as you can see. You don't need to read the detail of that. Those were public acts. These are private acts. And here's an example of an act, an enclosure act. And here's an example of a fen drainage act. So what I've also done to make the failed legislation vital, to give it life, is I've constructed a database of the 14,000 acts as well on very similar principles, coded them in just the same way. And this means, so there's the acts database, and you can see it's pretty similar, in fact. And this means, therefore, you can do various things. You can count the number of acts by session, obviously. I don't need to go into that. But you can then, much more tellingly, do things like calculate success rates, the number of fails in relation to the number of acts. And you can see here that overwhelmingly, most sessions beneath 80%. So there's a non-trivial number of failures through the period, that there's a clear change which takes place in about a quarter century following the Glorious Revolution. So it sets up some very important findings which need explanation in one way or another. The constancy, the relative constancy of the success rate is interesting, but notice that if anything it reaches its peak in the 1750s and the early 1760s, which had long been recognised as the high point of the age of oligarchy. Thereafter, the success rate diminishes somewhat to about 75%. About a quarter of legislation is failing in the last quarter of the 18th century. Well, you might say, one of the things I've not discussed here is Parliament doesn't, it's slightly hinted at in this graph, Parliament doesn't use the calendar year. Parliament, as you know, operates by sessions, and sessions cut across calendar years and are of variable length and frequency. So you need to get a handle on that as well. So one of the things I've done is I've turned over each of those 63,300 whatever it was pages and noted down the dates that Parliament was actually meeting. I've simply printed off a calendar and I put a cross through each date. You can then input the data and you can then relate all of these numbers to how many days Parliament's also sitting. And that gives you some sort of measure of efficiency, but it can also throw up some other kinds of findings which you'd never have expected to have found, and aren't overwhelming, but nonetheless seem to be interesting. And this is an example of it. The frequency with which the House of Commons sat on Saturdays. Yeah. When I went through turning over these 63,000 pages, I never had it as something that I was interested in, what days of the week it might be meeting on. But it struck me as I was doing it, and this is an important point about my method, that Saturdays seemed to be more frequent at some period than at others. I was doing this as quickly as I possibly could, of course, it's incredibly boring work. I didn't really pin it down, but once the data's in there, you can process it and you can produce this graph. Most Parliament, generally speaking, did meet on Saturdays before the 1720s, 8 out of 10 Saturdays, and very frequently every Saturday. But from the 1720s, it stops meeting on Saturdays. 1720s is the advent of Sir Robert Walpole, allegedly the first Prime Minister. And what you've got an example of here is an example of parliamentary management. But it has implications for the whole, for ways in which we think about things like London life, the London season. In fact, parliamentarians there in London, what are they going to do at the weekend? They're going to go to the opera and things like that. Okay. So you can process the results in a variety of ways to throw up findings. Here's one finding, for example, the proportion of acts which are general, applying to the nation as a whole, to those which are specific, applying to specific places. And so that's interesting, but notice also the differential success rates that are involved. Specific acts much more likely to pass than general acts. That then needs explanation. This had never previously been suspected. It's now identified precisely as something. Here's another type of finding. I've given these, I think, in rank order of simply the number of acts and failed. Where is Parliament putting a lot of its legislative effort? Personal legislation is, in fact, very much to do with landowners, managing their estates, using Parliament rather than the central courts to renegotiate their landholding. Look how relatively few acts there are about religion, which seems interesting, I think. Differential success rates as well. You can find surprising or unexpected coincidences. Here's a graph of the dotted lines of numbers of enclosure acts, which I've already given you an example of, next to what are private estate acts, mostly those personal acts that I've just referred to. We knew the chronology of Enclosure Acts already. There's been a huge amount of work done, like very, very important work done on it. And this great collapse, this great rise, collapse and rise, that was well attested. What this graph shows, of course, is that the number of estate acts follows a similar pattern in those years around the American Revolution in 1776. And that then starts to open up again a series of questions, rather important questions, it seems to me. So we can see, hidden, what I think quantification has done in this case has set out some issues much more clearly, but exposed hidden patterns, which then prompt different questions, it seems to me. And that leads on, therefore, to a whole series of related phenomena which require investigation about the nature of ambition for the use of parliamentary statute, about the ways in which interest groups work. Notice that earlier example I gave you of the Guild of London. How frequently are guilds, for example, or chambers of commerce? How exclusive is oligarchical politics? What I've shown is that there's a huge amount of use of Parliament by non-property owners. What do property rights mean? Enclosure is a redistribution of property rights. How do property rights actually work? So this is, I think, in fact, quite a neat finding. This gives the success rate for different types of, basically, infrastructural development. So the transport network, or network's the wrong word, but transportation in Britain, 1660 to 1800. So road legislation overwhelmingly succeeds, 85%. Rivers, at the other end, it's 48%. They're both specific types of legislation. They both apply to particular locales. Why should road acts mostly pass and river acts mostly don't? That sets a question. And I mean, the answer is, when you think about it, and it's interesting, in fact, basically, the top two there, road or enclosure, are land. Bridges and crossings are land and water, and then it's water. Water is politically controversial. Why should water be so politically controversial? Basically because it has many more uses than roads. It can be used for navigation, transport, by fishermen, by fowlers, by millers, by farmers, to irrigate, to drain, to fertilise, deliberate flooding, and so on. So different uses, different interests. So it's what lawyers call, it throws up a very complicated sets of what lawyers call riparian rights. So the whole structure of rights is more complex with regard to water than with regard to road. And the project has thrown up a number of other things as well. Okay, well, I must press on. So I hope that's given you some idea. So that's a project I've been working on for many years. I published a summation of it in 1996, but it's spun off and this, again, in a way, is a summary of those two databases, a short article in the Historical Journal. But it's spun off in various ways. And I want to mention two ways, two short examples by way of reaching the end. The first of them is clearly in my opinion, people are activated not simply by self-interest, but by ideas. As you might suppose, there's a long-standing view that particular economic ideas were particularly influential in the period that that I'm interested in. Most often, in fact, for example, there's a rhetoric about this being the age of mechanicalism. So I thought, well, let me try and press at this a little bit and see if I can't quantify a bit. Well, actually, you can quantify a bit about ideas, or at least about some representations of ideas. So you can nowadays go to Google Ngram. Anyone here use Google Ngram? Anyone here ever heard of Google Ngram? Okay, so we all know about, well, we perhaps have this notion of Google Books. So Google Books have scanned quite a lot of books, not as many as Google like to make out, not as many people think, but nonetheless, millions of books it's scanned. And basically, you can do a free text search in Google Books and see when particular words cropped up. In fact, I did a search for nuance. But I've chosen here to give you the graph for mercantilism, the frequency of the use of mercantilism in books which have been scanned in Google Books, as against the term mercantile system. We'd long known that the word mercantilism was an anachronism to the period it was applied to. It's invented in Germany in the late 19th century, and as you can see there, it really takes off in the 1920s and 30s. And it's Keynes in 1936 who promotes it especially. He has a chapter on it in the general theory, and it becomes embedded in serious discourse then. So that's quite neat. You can see that it didn't exist before the late 19th century. And mercantile system is used a bit, but not very heavily. It gets overtaken and is on the decline. Mercantilism has come to replace that. So one can get a bit of sense of historiography from that. But I thought I'd try and push, so this in fact was a fairly recent thing. I thought I would try and get a handle on ideas in a different way. The great problem here for historians of economic thought in 18th century Britain, it is a problem, is Adam Smith. Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations in 1776. It's a great book. I teach a course on it. The problem is it's enormously distorting. There's an incredible tendency to think that things are leading up to Smith and things lead away from Smith, as if there's nothing else. It has this very important teleological role. So you can imagine I'm suspicious of that. And what I found, I'm certainly not the first person to find it, was that in the early 1760s, someone called Joseph Massey started collecting works of what we would call economic literature. He called them works of commercial knowledge. And he produced a catalogue of his library comprising over 2,000 works, the manuscript for which is in the British Library, a printed edition for which exists, but the printed edition doesn't contain all of the information. So that warning again, go back to the manuscript source just to check that the printed source is full. So you can imagine what I did with Massey. I entered this data, about 2,000 books, whether it's a named author, an obvious pseudonym, anonymous, year of publication, subject matter. Massey used his own subject scheme, and then my own subject scheme. I don't have the time to go into the findings, but I'm simply giving you an idea that you can do. This is an example of bibliographical analysis, or bibliometrics, if you like. This is the frequency of works in Massey's. And what you can see there are spikes. And these, in fact, and you can see here, in this case, the South Sea bubble does crop up in 1720. There it is, a big spike of literature. There are other findings which are about how many of these works are short, 5, 10, 20 pages. We think of works of economic, so The Wealth of Nations is a big book. It's hundreds of pages long, but most works of economic literature in the period are a dozen or two long. That's what they are. They're short, they're ephemeral. That's their point. They're addressing particular concerns. So that's interesting, but you can then find other interesting findings as well. This is the proportion of works which are anonymous. And you can see that the proportion of works that were anonymous in the 1660s was about a third, but by the 1730s it's approaching 3/4. That seems to me to be a striking development. It's explicable in a number of ways. You wouldn't have guessed it, I don't think really, that there's a trend here, fairly clear trend, of the growth of anonymity from the late 17th through to the 1730s and the 1740s. I'm not going to bother to explain it to you. I ought to finish soon, shouldn't I? The final example perhaps I won't even bother with this example, is work I've done on public finances, which again, it's about having a suspicion that there might be something worth counting. And I lodged in my memory this footnote from a book by T.S. Ashton called Economic Fluctuations in England, 1700 to 1800. Very important work for me for my research, which then led me to look at the geography of the excise. So patterns, regional patterns of public finance. Let me give you the most striking finding. Scottish per capita, so in this year of the independence vote, Scottish per capita gross revenue receipts. So how much was Scotland paying, or how much revenue was collected in Scotland compared to England and Wales? And you can see strikingly smaller shares. Okay? And again, this is about pinning things down quantitatively, precisely, so that questions are well settled. So let me conclude. There's a long tradition supposing that counting is inherently sterile. Jonathan Swift, the great Irish author of Gulliver's Travels and so on, wrote a famous satire on such things in something called The Modest Proposal. The Modest Proposal. And if you've not read it, I recommend it. It's a hoot. And it gives you recipes for cooking children. The great poet John Keats was said by his brother to be open, prodigal, and had no power of calculation whatsoever. No power of calculation whatsoever. There's this assumption that imagination is unquantitative, or quantification has no place in imagination. But I hope I've shown that actually that's not the case. That quantification should indeed proceed in concert with imagination, and that if you do it in certain ways, you can see things just as a poet can see things which hadn't previously been visible. It offers a particular perspective, a different voice. It's not, so quantification for me as a historian isn't just a toolbox, it's not just a language. Very important, this. It's not just some technique, I take it off the shelf. Okay, it's a different way of envisaging the past, and it seems to me an inherently legitimate way, and for me, in fact, quite a beautiful way. I know it's not for everyone's taste, and absolutely one of my views is that people should pursue history in different ways. At the very least, I think it is, as I hope I've shown, revealing. You can see things which would not otherwise be seen. Hopefully, it's also clear that it can be accessible and not mystifying. But it does take effort. It takes concentration. You need to read exactly what it is that this table is about, or that table, or that graph, or that graph. I hope I've labelled them correctly. They should be precisely right, but you have to read what that precision means. So you have to concentrate. You can't be lazy, and you can't switch off. I don't see why one should. That seems to me to be intellectually completely unjustifiable. But as I hope I've also shown, actually, there's also quite a lot of perspiration involved as well. Don't imagine that you can just go to the shelf and pull off sources and you can quantify them and it will be easy. That's not how it works. Yeah? That is how some economic historians do it, and their work seems to me to be significantly limited as a consequence. That quick and easy approach often leads to work which is badly undercontextualised and leads to false conclusions. There are plenty of limits to quantification. I could go on about that, but perhaps I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Julian. We have a little bit of time for questions. If people have any, I see some in the audience. So yes, please, gentlemen.
More of a comment. I'm just completing a PhD on a different area and region, 16th century typographic history, personally in France and Italy. And one of the things I did in the course of it was to use various sources which had gone into the Parisian archives as to the trades existing in Paris, printing trade particularly. So I thought, well, it's interesting, let's see how many there were. Because I had a clue that perhaps the particular trade I was interested in, punch cutters, I didn't know how many or what percentage there were. It turned out they were very small. We had an enormous number of booksellers and printers,
Yes.
but very, very few actually serving them.
Yes.
And that to me brought up, and then suddenly I'm going to see that actually you had evidence that either you didn't need that many, or for whatever reason,
That's right.
they didn't develop.
Yes.
And that raised also certain questions about, and I wasn't doing economic history at all, I was doing typographic history, if you like.
Yes.
And I was interested in distribution types, which I use some of this. But I found it, at first I wasn't sure it was particularly intellectually rigorous or relevant.
Yes.
But I used it, and actually what you said gives me a certain justification that it was a valid way of looking at that data.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think obviously the point I've tried to get across is that quantification can be an ends, but it's also often a means. It enables you to take other steps which you wouldn't previously have thought could have been taken. It just wouldn't have occurred to you that this is a path that might be pursued. And it seems to me that opening up that is very valuable, I think.
I also wanted to mention something, a project I worked on some years ago, which was the Randstad project in the Netherlands. And what they did is they did a statistical analysis of a whole variety of issues per square kilometre. And then they put this, I suppose, I don't know how they did, they must have used a mainframe, and they came up with these rather extraordinary graphs, or maps actually, which showed density of transport, of industry. And on that, they based certain planning results. I mean, that's that also was somewhat historical. As well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'm. It's one of the many gaps in my abilities. But the mapping of data has grown as a very powerful tool, I think, in the last couple of decades. In fact, and obviously there's a lot of this legislation stuff that I do. I'm interested in where things are happening, particular places. I'm interested in networks. So a particular county would have perhaps lots of enclosure acts, some road acts, some river acts as well. And it's interesting to see how these networks develop.
Please, there's a question.
I've got a practical question actually. Just have you found that Excel works well? You haven't used Access?
No, I prefer the simplicity. So Access is a relational database, and I simply prefer the simplicity of this flatter database approach.
Yes.
I find Excel excellent. I mean, I know it's very unpopular to commend Microsoft, but it. The graphs that in my thesis were all drawn by hand. And if you got to 1760 and made a mistake, you had to start again. And one of the things you can do, one of the things I perhaps said more about is how I play about with the data. So once you've got the data there, you've cleaned the data, you've tried to spot the obvious inputting errors, you then start playing around with it, seeing what sort of cross-tabulations work, different periodizations, and so on. And one of the things you can do so well with Excel is try different types of graphs. For example, you just trot them out so easily, including moving averages as well, to give you trends very, very quickly. So you can, and so I play around with the data quite a lot to try and find ways of presenting things. So I find Excel excellent. Yeah. And you can do it, obviously nowadays, and with it, of course, you can set up If you become very expert at it, and I'm not, you can do conditional formatting, so it sort of limits how you put stuff in. It can speed up the whole inputting process. It's worth, I read seriously, I think Excel is excellent and it's worth getting to know well. Yeah.
Yes, is there I'm wondering if there's I feel like I need to do a course, or there must be things online, I guess, that you can...
There's bound to be something good on YouTube. Exactly. I started off as a Macintosh user. In 1997, I decided to move to PC. When I did so, I simply bought a series of books, one of which was about Excel. So this is Excel 97. But I read it. I took it away on holiday with me. So I did, seriously. Oh dear, you knew I was sad. And so by the time I got back, and in fact I did buy in those days you used to be able to buy a big manual for it as well, and I bought that. But obviously the world's moved on, yeah. But Excel is excellent, it's worth getting to know well.
Excel does a course on Excel. Might be worth looking into it.
Right, yes.
The training division.
Yeah.
You can ask them. I remember doing it.
Yeah. Oh, that's helpful.
Good.
Yeah.
There was a question at the back.
You just briefly, my question's about when your data's missing or flaky, as
Yes.
lots of. I deal with very old stuff. I'm just started my classics PhD
Yes.
this week.
Yes.
And I'm looking at kind of a class of people and as a class and as individuals.
Yes.
So some of the time I'm going to have plenty of information
Yes.
and quite positive
Yes.
about how you sort of how you when you say that the records got burned into House of Commons, you've got an obvious gap in your data,
Yes.
or different
Yes.
types, or your data
Yes.
changes going through.
Yes.
Thank you.
So in the bankruptcy material, this information about creditors only existed for 1710 to 1764. I can't quite remember the dates. So I didn't use the London Gazette for that period because that source was richer. That meant that I then had to do some comparisons because basically the source that I used had some people listed who weren't in fact then declared bankrupt. The creditor made the claim that they were bankrupt, but it wasn't founded. So I had to do some sample years of comparing them and then deflate the numbers from 1710 to 1764. Arguably, in the end, undoubtedly, that's imprecise. I don't think the error margin's too much of a worry, but that's how I proceeded. But my overwhelming approach is I simply operate in a different evidential environment, very different evidential environment to you. So I try and look at all records for what it is I'm recording. So all bankrupts, all legislation. What I don't have is all information about those, but I limit myself to those things for which I've got common data. So I know when every act was, what in broad terms it was about. I don't know where it always applied to. So you can see this is the acts database, but it would be the same for the fails. If you look at the geography, column I, there are AA there. And what that means is it's not known where it applied. So it might be an act relating to the estate of John Smith and not tell you where the estate of John Smith was. So I just put in AA in those. And so actually when you come to analyse geography in this legislation database, that's a real problem. So what I do is I say, whatever it is, 70% is unknown. But for those, I'm going to sound like Donald Rumsfeld now, for those which it's known, then you can make calculations. So that's how. So my problems are very different from yours.
I was just wondering
Yes.
if you encountered that and how you got them.
Yes. I'm obviously very sensitive to the point about Massey's bibliography being just what one person collected. So at one stage, I put in a grant application, quite a good grant application, which I didn't get, which would have basically used... so we have a brilliant resource for 18th century historians, and 17th century historians, called the English Short Title Catalogue, which is an online listing of all books published in English before 1800. It's amazing. And so I had this vision of producing a much more comprehensive bibliography of works of commercial knowledge using this, in fact, and that would have got round the limitations of Massey. So what I can do is I can tell you what Massey's bibliography tells us, but not how representative Massey is. In fact, I did publish an article in which it's the core. I compared it to a couple of other bibliographies which have been done. So that gave a sort of comparator. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're going to have to wind it up as we sort of run out of time. But the next lecture in this series will be in 2 weeks' time on the 29th of January, and it will be given by John Pullinger from the Royal Statistical Society. But before we leave, and I hope you'll come along to that, before we leave, let's thank Julian again for a really excellent initial lecture.